runs clear, and we'll heave and heave together, for New England home we'll steer.
Sea Change, historical vignettes dealing with the twilight of the great sailing ships and the dawn of the steam age at sea. To start us off, a quote from Walt Whitman's Song of the Open Road. We will sail pathless and wild seas. We will go where winds blow, waves dash, and the Yankee clipper speeds under full sail. Twilight came very slowly, almost imperceptibly, upon the sailing ships. Man had used them from before the time of recorded history. The effects of the winds, their power to move a ship over the sea, seized and held the imagination of sailors, merchants, geographers, and kings for many centuries. The very early seagoing people, the Phoenicians, had their wind guards, and the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Vikings had theirs also. The sailors who came home from a voyage told stories which the bards picked up and made into epics. Men began to write books about the winds. Shipmasters compiled their own very private wind charts, plotting on them the courses their vessels should follow to make the homeward voyage as fast as possible. Knowledge of the winds and their uses attained their highest degree of concentration during the American clipper ship period of 1850 to 60. It was very keenly needed. Clipper ship masters reckoned the performance of their vessels in premiums that would bring thousands of dollars for each day saved on a run. Those vessels often carried as many as 33 sails, which meant 2 acres of canvas were spread aloft. Aboard the most extreme of their class, the mainmast truck stood 200 feet above the deck. Men have not built or sailed such ships since. They are forever gone. But for many years after their economic purpose was proven to be past, the challenge of their beauty, their grace, and their speed persisted. The departure of a clipper like Rainbow, Flying Cloud, or Lightning from her East River pier in the port of New York in the 1850s was an unforgettable sight. The usual custom was to bring the ship down from her loading berth and anchor her off Castle Garden at the foot of Manhattan. The owners boarded there for a glass of sherry and a final word with the captain. Then they went ashore, and the anchor catted, a tall stacked tug took on the tow line, and the ship went with the ebb tide and started for the lower bay, Sandy Hook, and the open sea. Bordering the equator, caught the southeast trades, hauled her braces sharp up, and kept heading for Cape Horn. Her daily runs averaged around 300 miles. The watches even sang a shanty as they yanked at the pump handles in the morning before they turned to with holystones, deck swabs, and the saltwater hose. The captain paced the deck alone, proud, remote, a figure the sailors had come to respect and fear. For it was the captain who would make the fateful decisions off Cape Horn. He owned the absolute authority to send all hands aloft in the middle of a black and screaming night. If he so wished, he could keep up a canvas spread until topmasts snapped, spars and sails thrashed beyond control, and men were killed or drowned. The The young sailors tightened their belts as they listened to the old-timers' stories. They wiped the sweat from the palms of their hands on their dungarees. Then once more, they looked high aloft, where the royal yards swung in erratic arcs across the sky. There were no more shanties in the morning when the ship reached 50 degrees south latitude and squared away for the western traverse into the Pacific. Men talked about very little except ship's work. This before them was the supreme test for any sailor. And when it was achieved, when the ship had beaten through into the Pacific, the young green hands in the crew felt a new confidence in themselves. They were veterans now of Cape Horn, and no better sailors lived. It gave them great pride in spite of the torture of frostbite, sea boils, weeks of cold food, wet clothes, and sodden bunks.
Blow the man down. A flash-looking packet I chance for to make.
Oh, give me some time to blow the man down. Blow the man down, bullies, blow the man down. To be way, blow the man down. Blow him right back to Liverpool town. Oh, give me some time to blow the man down.
She was bowling along with the wind blowing free.
To be way, blow the man down.
The courage and skill of the men who sailed the swift, graceful clippers were not enough to stave off the inevitable. Many signs clearly indicated the future and warned that wind-driven ships could not continue to dominate the sea trade. The first was the successful run in 1809 of the steamer Phoenix from Hoboken to Philadelphia. The second was the establishment by Samuel Cunard of a regular steamer service from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Boston, and then across the Atlantic to Liverpool. Boston merchants, delighted with the profits that steam might bring them, made Cunard guest of honor at several champagne banquets, and even paid for a tug to break a channel through the ice for one of his steamers when Massachusetts Bay froze over. The same group of merchants, though, kept investing in or buying extreme clippers of the kind built by Donald Mackay in his East Boston yard. Steamers, they said, were really stink pots and were infested with riff-raff Liverpool Irish firemen, and a great part of the potential cargo space was taken up by coal bunkers. And why buy coal when all the winds of the world were out there to move a ship? Besides, tea carried in steamers had a coal smoke flavor when the cargoes arrived from the Orient. Only in sailing vessels was the flavor fully retained, unblemished. Then the dubious, those who thought steamers might win out somehow, were told to recall the history of the ship Savannah. When she was built in 1819, she was supposed to be a definite threat to sailing ships. But the steamer, on her maiden voyage to the United Kingdom, used her sails a great deal more than her paddle wheels. And then further, it was pointed out that Donald Mackay took only 60 days to build the extreme clipper Stag Hound. She made on her first voyage to California and China in 1851 enough money to pay for herself and a profit of $80,000 for her owners. The clipper ship crews realized that competition was extremely sharp, that their jobs might not last, and soon could be taken from them by more practical vessels, sturdy, broad-beam packet ships, big cargo carriers. All these dominated a lot of the transatlantic trade and kept regular schedules with European ports in Boston, New York, and Baltimore. The packets were also active in the passenger business, moving European immigrants westward by the thousands. One of the most famous packet lines was the Blackball line, started in 1816. Its little 300 to 500 ton ships flew the red swallowtail flag with a black ball in the middle. And they ran regularly twice a month from New York to Liverpool and back, whatever the weather. They were heavily sparred and carried large crews. The officers were notoriously hard, working pressure was fierce, and a great deal of vehement singing went on.
I served me time in the black ball line.
To me way, hey, hey, hurrah! Oh,
In the black ball line, serve me time.
hurrah for the black ball line.
The black ball ships, they are good and true.
To me way, hey, hey, hurrah! Oh,
They are the ships for me and you.
hurrah for the black ball line.
Once there was a black ball ship.
To me way, hey, hey, hurrah!
Oh, that
Oh,
14 knots an hour could clip.
hurrah for the black ball line.
You will surely find a rich gold mine.
To me way, hey, hey, hurrah!
Oh, just take a trip in the black ball line.
Hurrah for the black ball line.
Just take a trip to Liverpool.
To me way, hey, hey, hurrah!
Oh, to Liverpool, that Yankee school.
Hurrah for the black ball line.
The Yankee sailors you'll see there.
To me way, hey, hey, hurrah!
Oh, with red top boots and short-cut hair.
Hurrah for the black ball line.
But the clipper ship sailors felt as long as a clipper could run her 300 miles and better a day, she was still queen of the seas, the finest vessel afloat. But William H. Webb, the astute New York shipbuilder, in the peak year of 1853, when more than 50 clippers were launched, decided that he would stop construction of the type. He gave over the work in his East River yard to the building of steamships, vessels of war, and other similar packet vessels. Webb was completely right in his estimate for the need for change. By the end of 1853, it was obvious that there were not sufficient cargoes for all the fine, new, heavily rigged clippers. Cargo rates had been as high as $60 a ton at the peak of the California boom. Now they were much lower, and just about what an owner would accept to keep his vessel active. McKay's winner, Flying Cloud, was idle for 2.5 years as her agents hunted cargo for her, and they were finally glad to take $10 a ton for San Francisco freight. The final blow was dealt the clippers in 1854 and 5, when the Panama Railroad across the Isthmus of Panama was finished and opened. There was no more Cape Horn trash for the skysail yarders. For the men who built the railroad put into operation a fleet of steamers that operated from Panama northward to San Francisco and at premium passenger and cargo rates. Donald McKay, a stubborn Scot with dreams he refused to relinquish, kept on building clippers. He was determined, in spite of the advice of his friends, to build the biggest of them all. Her name was to be Great Republic. The bankers and the merchants were skeptical and refused to invest. McKay built her with his own money and lost heavily when she was swept by fire as she lay at a New York yard waiting for her rigging work. There were other ships for McKay to build. He went on to construct for James Baines, the Scottish ship owner, some of the most lovely shop-line clippers. He experimented also with iron hulls and iron frames that took wooden planking. Then in desperation, and almost financially ruined, he built several steamers. It was the end for him. He retired to a Massachusetts farm inland from the sea. Twilight had obscured the dreams that had been with him since boyhood. He was not bitter as he recognized that the ships which he had designed and whose beauty were unmatched were, after a span of 10 years, no longer wanted in international trade. But he felt rejected, thrust aside, and made to seem almost ridiculous. Donald McKay died in the midst of his family, respected and deeply loved by them and hundreds of friends. But he could not have had much reluctance about meeting death. His life had really peaked back on that wind-filled, brilliant day when Flying Cloud logged 374 sea miles. The severe financial depression in the United States during 1856 and 7 collapsed the last lingering dreams of the clipper ship owners. They could no longer afford the Cape Horn gamble. Steamers carried California cargoes for what they were worth and at much lower insurance rates for the shipper. Chinese tea was still being drunk in large quantities, but the public refused to quibble about smoke taint or mildew because of the iron hulls of the steamers. At the Portuguese colony of Macau and at Whampoa in the Pearl River below Canton, China, the steamers got the pick of the new crop for European, British, and American consumption.
Our packet is the island lass.
Lowlands, 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 low.
There's a laddie howling at the maintop mast.
Lowlands, 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 low.
The old man hails from Barbados.
Lowlands, 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 low.
He's got the name Old Hammer Toes.
Lowlands, 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 low.
He gives us bread as hard as brass.
Lowlands, 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 low.
Our junk's as salt as Balaam's ass.
Lowlands, 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 low.
The monkeys rigged in the soldier's clothes.
Lowlands, 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 low.
The American shipbuilders had to meet great competition in the international market, but they refused to put down any vessels that resembled the early clippers. They designed instead a class that came to be known as Downeasters and proved to be seaworthy, fast enough, and above all, profitable when operated against the steadily growing steamer fleets. Their main purpose was to haul California grain around Cape Horn to the East Coast, and their real designation was that of a medium clipper. They got their name from the fact that nearly all of them were built in Bath and Searsport and Rockland, Maine, East Boston, Mass, and Newburyport, and in Mystic and Stonington in Connecticut. But then the other main seaport towns, Damariscotta, Thomaston, Yarmouth, Frankfort, Richmond, Phippsburg, Camden, Newcastle, Waldoboro, Kennebunk, and Kennebunkport, expanded their shipyards and began construction of the Downeaster type. History stretched back vividly and unbrokenly in the main seaport villages, back into the earliest of colonial times in the 17th century, back to the French and Indian Wars and the Revolution. The villages were very much the same as when they had been rebuilt after the last Indian or British burning. The hip-roofed white houses, bright in neat, tight rows against the somber immensity of the forest, the fast-running river, the bay below the wharves, the fish sheds, and the shipyards. Tawny yellow Tibetan rugs were on the living room floors in some of these houses. Clipper shipmasters had brought them home. And chests made of camphor wood or mango, with broad brass hinges and locks. There were ormolu clocks and embroidered fire screens, and chandeliers that caught the afternoon sunlight and cast reflections upon paneled walls. Right into the 1870s and 80s, mothers told their daughters how, when they were small, they had stood upon the widow's walks of these houses and watched the clippers come home from the sea. The little town of Searsport had 12 shipyards along 6 miles of waterfront. And that same town, during the years of 1870s to 80s, supplied more than 70% of all the masters for the American merchant marine. Men had gone to sea as young boys from up and down that winding coast of Maine as far back as anyone could remember. And boys became men in that awful Cape Horn ordeal while the wind ships, usually in ballast, bucked against the prevailing westerly gales. Even into the later days of sailing, in the 1920s and 30s, the price paid by the crews was extreme. Archibald Russell lost 2 boys in 1928, swept from her jib boom. Killoran gave 2, knocked overside from an unprotected wheel in a 1930 gale. Lowhill, Penang, and Lingard each lost 1 from aloft. 2 boys from the Panap were washed overside, and Berry aboard the Olive Bank, caused by poor food, took the lives of 4 more.
She engaged with the captain, a cabin boy to be. The wind had been in favor, so they put out to sea. The captain's lady being on board, she seemed in great joy, so glad the captain had engaged the handsome cabin boy. Her cheeks appeared as roses, with her locks all in a curl. The sailors oft times smiled and said he looks just like a girl. But eating captain's biscuits sheer colour did destroy, and the wasted swell of pretty Nell, the handsome cabin boy.
The last of the clippers of the Donald Mackay epoch served out their time, short-rigged and sluggish, in the North Atlantic timber trade to Europe, or were cut down to coal hulks or barges. The Downeasters soon followed them, and the nation which had brought the sailing ship to the highest degree of performance in history looked forward without enthusiasm to the age of steam. Even the men who sailed the last of the square riggers and the schooners knew that within no more than a few years they would be forced to handle power-driven craft. It was that or stay ashore. Steamers now touched at all the ports in Maine, put into Nantucket and New Bedford, ran from Providence to New York on schedules just as promptly kept as the trains. Out on the banks, the big and fast transatlantic liners were a terrible hazard for the dorymen off the fishing schooners. They were only given the chance to hear the onrush, look upward through the fog at the sharp sweep of the bow before the instant of final crushing impact. Industrial expansion was changing every form of life in Europe, Great Britain, and the United States, and had a direct effect upon world shipping. The transportation of manufactured goods, raw materials between the continents doubled, and doubled again, and then once more again in the second half of the 19th century. Across the land, first canals and then railroads carried the huge amounts of goods. Wooden ships had shown themselves to be unsafe. Ship construction now came from the new materials in mass use, iron and steel plate, which gave much better hull protection. But increased speed was also needed. Profits would be realized just as fast as raw materials were hauled from overseas to the factories. During his 1908 expedition to Antarctica, Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton sent out a party of his men to South Georgia Island, about 1,000 miles due east of Cape Horn. While exploring the island, the men stumbled on a deeply winding, narrow bay, and what they saw floating on its waters astounded them. Surging back and forth on the waves was an almost limitless mass of ship's wreckage, a grim record of the ships lost in the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific around Cape Horn. A freak of the great easterly current that flows past Cape Horn had brought the wreckage back miles along the coast into this bay. Shackleton's men made a record of it. There were skylight benches, antique handrails with the Turk's head ornaments still intact, studding sail poles, lifeboat rudders, oars, a fractured companionway, and a sextant case that carried the brass plate of a famous London maker. Peace nudged peace in a sort of endless agitation. Hatchboards bumped broken boat planks. A yard arm that trailed its gear touched a fractured cabin tabletop. A sea chest lay sluggish in the current and yet buoyant, and alongside it drifted trail boards and a light screen. The deaths of dozens of ships could be marked, but just how they had been lost and where were a part of the immense Cape Horn mystery. As the end of commercial usefulness of the big sailing ships came closer, ship owners would be set by too many greater difficulties to worry much about manpower problems. There were always enough sailors on the waterfront. Sometimes the men could not speak the language of the country in whose vessels they served, and often they deserted the ship at the first port of call. Ship owners and masters accepted this philosophically. In a trade that had shrunk to a quarter of its size from 1880 to 1900, crew replacements were a minor consideration. Crews were still found for the rest along Lime Street in Liverpool, and East India Dock Road in London, South and Cherry Streets in New York, and around Scully Square in Boston. The ship owners believed if a man were hungry enough, he would go to sea on anything that floated. The discharge books of the 1880-1900 period showed that sailors shipped out with no particular type of vessel in mind. They had no national preference, except that generally British seamen stayed away from American ships. And because of the great language barrier, Americans rarely signed articles aboard Scandinavian ships. But otherwise, their choice was completely free. Men lost their sense of nationality after a few years in the forecastles of the deepwater ships. They talked a polyglot language, most of it English, but with Spanish, Scandinavian, and Malaysian words in it. The boatswain was often called Tuan. The topgallant sail was known as the Bram. A man would tell his watchmate to move muy rapido. Here's a shanty that's a typical product of this mixing of many races. This is called Reuben Ranzo, a great favorite among topgallant halyard shanties, and it has been suggested that Ranzo is a corruption of the name Lorenzo. American whaling ships often recruited Portuguese seamen in the Azores, and Ranzo may have been one of these. However, if it did originate in whaling vessels, it seems to have spread very quickly to all other types of ships, both American and British.
Oh, poor old Reuben Ranzo, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. Oh, poor old Reuben Ranzo, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. Oh, Ranzo was no sailor, Ranzo, boys, Ranzo. So he shipped aboard a whaler, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. Oh, Ranzo was no beauty, Ranzo, boys, Ranzo. So he couldn't do his duty, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. Because he was so dirty, Ranzo, boys, Ranzo. We gave him 35, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. The skipper's daughter Susie, Ranzo, boys, Ranzo. Well, she begged her dad for mercy, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. Oh, she gave him wine and water, Ranzo, boys, Ranzo. And a bit more than she ought, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. Well, he got his first mate papers, Ranzo, me boys, Ranzo. He's a terror to the whalers.
This kind of life fostered eccentric characteristics. Some of the men, among them the older sailors, would not leave a ship when she was alongside the dock and port. They were divorced from shore. The ship was their only home. They knew little but the working of her. The future was death in a storm, or a vague, bleak last few years in a seaman's boarding house on the little money that they had been able to save. The younger men, when they went ashore, very seldom left the dockside area. They spent their money in saloons that catered to sailors and were almost identical all over the world. The majority of the sailors could not read or write. Their severance from their families was complete. Their single, fierce pride was the ability to perform a ship's work quickly and with great skill. One Cape Horn ship of the period carried in her forecastle a shaggy-haired sailor who was soon given the name Paraffin. It was his habit to eat a mouthful of paraffin every morning before going out on deck. That, he said, kept out the cold. Paraffin lasted around the Horn, but was in pretty poor shape when the ship reached San Francisco. He was taken to the hospital for extensive overhaul. His bilges was kind of clogged, a shipmate said of him. Eccentric behavior was, however, not confined to the crew. Perhaps some of the most peculiar behavior was exhibited by Captain William McGowan, master of the Scottish iron-hulled clipper Benvenue. He was known as Mad McGowan for the way he held on to sail in a storm when other masters displayed far more caution. Yet what appeared as his maddest prank took place in Glasgow when his ship was tied up alongside the dock, and according to witnesses, he was sober at the time. He hung a large sign in the rigging stating, "No Irish need apply." The ship was docked in the notorious Govan area of the city. It was crowded with Irish people who had been driven to Scotland by severe famines at home. The men sought work in the Clydesdale shipyards and ships and were sharply disliked by their Scottish neighbors. Captain McGowan's sign brought an instant barrage of refuse, dead cats, and public house crockery. Then a number of strapping Irishmen, the pick of their kind in the port, boarded Benvenue and demanded work as sailors. Captain McGowan hired enough of them to fill the starboard watch, half of the crew. For the other half, the port watch, he hired men just as big and strong. All of them were American, sailors who had learned their trade in the Cape Horn clippers. They were Negroes, nearly all of them from Carroll County in Virginia, where seagoing had been a tradition for centuries. Irishmen who were already smarted from underprivilege became furiously angry and jealous of their Negro shipmates. There was extreme competition on deck and aloft when Benvenue put to sea. Fights between the men of the two watches inevitably followed. Both sides nursed their wounds, and after a while, the friction disappeared. The watches worked together amiably and well throughout the rest of the voyage. But Mad McGowan was far from mad, nor was he playing some grim racial joke. The shrewd Scotchman had simply schemed up a way of getting himself just about the best crew that ever sailed a ship. The national and racial rivalry gave him the chance to squeeze more hard work out of both watches than any master had ever succeeded in getting from his men. Yet this same McGowan showed more concern for the welfare of his crew than many another master. His ships invariably were good feeders, and the forecastle was as comfortable as could be gotten under the conditions then prevailing. When the Civil War broke out, the men called into the United States Navy served mainly in steam-propelled vessels, or frigates and sloops of war that were moved by both steam and sail. A group of about 100 British officers, a number of them on half-pay leave from the Royal Navy, picked up steamer knowledge at the same time. They ran the blockade between the Bahamas and the Confederate-held ports on the Atlantic coast and made huge payoffs from the traffic. When the war ended, a new generation of American seamen had been created. The sailing ship men called them steamer stiffs, but the men who worked in the steam-driven vessels, deck officers and engineers, were not greatly concerned. They could see the future, and sail had small part in it. They had, further, inherited the tradition of the first steamer men, who, particularly in the port of New York, were a hardy and stubborn breed. The early American steamers of 1820 to 30s and 40s represented enormous danger for their crews. They carried such names as Dreadnought, and rightly so. A description of a pioneer steamcraft made even a sailing ship man wince. They gathered in the bars along New York South Street and listened grimly as steamer men described how close to the waterline the deck came. "She has no more freeboard than a frying pan." A man who worked aboard such craft might at any moment be blown up by a boiler failure, beheaded by a piece of fractured engine machinery, rammed and drowned by competitors in sailing vessels or other steamers, or beaten senseless on the dock by various factions of the opposition. There was another ship named Dreadnought, built in Massachusetts, that was famous and had a song written about.
That is a flash packet of fame. She hails from New York and the Dreadnought's her name. She's bound to the westward where the stormy winds blow. Bound away in the Dreadnought to the westward we'll go, daddy down, 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 daddy down. Now the Dreadnought, she lies in the river Mersey, awaiting the tugboat to take her to sea, out around the rock light where the salt tides do flow. Bound away to the westward in the Dreadnought we'll go, daddy down, 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 daddy down. Now the Dreadnoughts are howling down the wild Irish Sea, our passengers merry with hearts full of glee, as sailors like lions walk the deck to and fro. She's the Liverpool packet, oh Lord, let her go, daddy down, 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 daddy down. Now the Dreadnoughts are sailing the Atlantic so wide, where the high roaring seas roll along her black side, with her sails tautly set for the Red Cross to show. She's the Liverpool packet, oh Lord, let her go, daddy down.
Deliberate rammings off the New York Battery and along the Hudson and East Rivers were daily occurrences. A good many were avoided only because the rammers feared the boiler explosion might sink their own craft. And when steamer competition stiffened, collisions became more frequent and often serious, with major injury to passengers, crews, and vessels. One steamer captain, flipping over the wheels so that his vessel ran bow on into another, let out a joyous yell at the moment of impact. "There she goes, right into the goddamn ladies' cabin!" Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had started as a barge deckhand, was a firm believer in the get-tough tactics. He operated with brutal skill in the port, driving all but the strongest steamer line competitors out of business. His People's Line had a fleet of nearly 50 vessels. He fought bitterly to take trade away from the Citizens Line, owned by Daniel Drew, and the Union Line and the North River Line. Fares from New York to Albany were drastically reduced in the 1840s as the powerful companies sought to control the trade. They went from $3 down to $1, then to a dime, and from that to nothing. The small companies disappeared, broke, unable to compete any longer. Vanderbilt's line kept in business by charging high prices for staterooms and meals. Then gradually, passenger fares were returned. Similar strategies were employed to take over the lucrative Long Island Sound service and the coastwise lines. Most small companies were forced to sell out to a monopoly directed by Vanderbilt. The only profound change in shipboard life was the introduction of engineers. They were held responsible by the operators for a large share of the performance and safety of the vessel, and their qualifications were manifest. For at least 50 years, their presence in a ship was fiercely resented by the masters and the mates and even unlicensed deck personnel. Many masters refused to have anything but the most formal contact with their engineers, never entered the engine rooms, seldom left the bridge during a voyage, and gave all their orders to the engine department by telegraph or speaking tube from the wheelhouse. The hostile attitude on the part of the deck force created a long-lasting hatred. Men who worked below in a steamer came to be known as the Black Gang, and it was meant as a term of contempt. Forecastles, even mess rooms, were kept separate. According to the men on deck, the engine department members never washed and used buckets only to sit on while supposedly at work below. Fights were common between members of the two departments, either at sea or in port, and on the slightest pretext. It was sometimes necessary during a long and savage battle in port to call the police to stop them. They fought each other with spanners, wrenches, fire hose nozzles, marlin spikes, knives, and bottles. The work below in the crude, badly ventilated, poorly lit, and dangerously cramped fire rooms did not appeal to men of American birth. The jobs went to the wild and brawny Liverpool Irish, the Greeks, Italians, Spaniards, men who boasted that they could stand the intense heat, the dust, the gases, and the back-breaking labor. There were as yet no American maritime unions to regulate working conditions. Most firemen and coal passers were illiterate, signed their mark on the ship's papers, lived to get drunk in the port of call, stay with a whore for an hour or so, return aboard, and go back to the coal scoop.
All for me grog, for me jolly, jolly grog. All for me grog and tobacco. For I spent all my store with the lasses on the shore. And it's all for me grog and tobacco. All for me grog, for me jolly, jolly grog. All for me grog and tobacco. For I spent all my store with the lasses on the shore. And it's all for me grog and tobacco. When I come home, then the sweetheart I shall see. All for me grog and tobacco. And my sweetheart will sing when she sees the wedding ring. And it's all for me grog and tobacco. All for me grog, for me jolly, jolly grog. All for me grog and tobacco. For I spent all my store with the lasses on the shore. And it's all for me grog and tobacco. When she's a son for to dangle on her name. All for me grog and tobacco. And she'll sing him to sleep while I sail the stormy deep.
Firemen, in the lesser numbers, the coal passes, did not last long on the ships. 12 years at most, and they were gone. Tuberculosis finished them, or pneumonia, rheumatism, alcohol, or venereal disease. Yet all of them were proud of their calling. Some of the Liverpool lot wore a single gold earring, knotted a clean sweat rag around their throats when they went below on watch, used soap and water, and changed their underwear before they swaggered off the ship in port. On the Great Lakes, sail power had dominated the trade for a century. The first of the lake schooners, Nancy, was built in 1789 at Detroit, Michigan. Others followed, and with a few years, a brisk trade had grown up to and from the lakeside cities. Then in 1818, the first lake steamer, with the name Walk in the Water, sailed from Black Rock, just outside Buffalo. The steamer proved to be far more efficient on the rivers between the lakes, and predictions were made that the schooners would soon be forced out of business. The prediction came true, but was a half-century in coming. For the local shipyards began to build schooners with square-rigged topsails on the foremast, and then used steam tugs to pull them through the rivers when the wind and the current weren't right. Chicago was built with schooner-hauled timber. The greatest sawdust pile in the world was believed to have been at Muskegon, Michigan. The schooners loaded there for the run across Lake Michigan, took deck loads of fresh pine until there was hardly clearance for the fore and main booms. "Timber out and horses back" was a well-known toast in Muskegon saloons in the big years right after the Civil War. The horses they were toasting walked on 2 legs. The schooners delivered the timber and returned from Chicago with reinforcements for the logging teams. The men were usually drunk. Old-timers claim that on a dark night they could smell a Muskegon-bound schooner long before they could see it. The competition was stiff between the various schooner companies, but only the Blue Bottom Line became so well known that a shanty was sung about it. The chorus went, "Watch 'em, catch 'em, jump up in the Joo-Poo-Joo. Give her the sheets and let her rip. We're the boys to crowd her through. Oh, you should have heard 'em holler as the wind went howlin' free. For we beat the fleet from Buffalo, Buffalo to Milwaukee." Back in Maine, shipyards continued building big, deep-water schooners long after the steamer competition had become too keen on the Great Lakes. In 1902, the only schooner with more than 6 masts was built. She was the cumbersome and slab-sided Thomas W. Lawson. built with 7 masts and the expectation on the part of her owners that she would be a successful bulk cargo carrier. But ships of her massive fore and aft rig were found to be very slow and clumsy when it was necessary to maneuver offshore in a storm. The flaw in the construction often proved fatal. Thomas W. Lawson went on the rocks off the Scilly Isles while on a foreign voyage and was lost with all hands. Most of the ships of her type were wrecked or foundered in shoal waters over the years. European ship operators never accepted the type, considering them too clumsy. The owners of the American ships kept their vessels in the coastwise trade. One of the most dramatic of coastwise schooner histories is that of the Myrtle B. Crowley. She was representative of her class, and the circumstances of her loss were similar to scores of other big bulk-carrying schooners. During an unusually heavy fog late in January 1910, the six-master lay hove to, wallowing in heavy ocean swells and frigid, calm air off Long Island. She was under the command of Captain William Haskell, with a crew of 13 men. Mrs. Haskell was aboard as a passenger. The schooner was northbound for Boston, with a full cargo of coal. The heavy sea and the accompanying fog that followed had caused Captain Haskell to lose his bearings. He had been on deck for 30 hours without sleep. When the weather cleared, the ship stood in close to shore under a fresh northwest breeze. But he and his 2 mates failed to establish correctly the characteristics of the coastal light they sighted in the darkness. They identified it as Shinnecock light. In reality, the strong easterly set of the current had put them more than 40 miles beyond it, and what they saw was North Light on Block Island. The captain increased his error by setting an east-northeast course and expected to raise Block Island before daylight, then head around through Vineyard Sound into port. Since he was already abreast of Block Island, his course took the ship south of No Man's Land and south of Martha's Vineyard. Myrtle B. Crowley piled up on the great Ross Shoal in the mass of rips that runs for miles from the southeast corner of the vineyard. The same heavy swell was still running, and the schooner hit hard, immediately lost her lifeboats and everything loose on deck. Here in shoal water, the action of the sea was rough and high. Captain Haskell, his mates and sailors, knew that they were in extreme danger. They had to abandon ship at once or go down in what was going to be left of the wreckage. Captain Haskell went below. His wife, a small woman, was still asleep and in her nightgown. He wrapped her in his waistcoat and rapidly climbed the companionway ladder with her in his arms. The hatches were being broken by the weight of the seas that crashed aboard. Water poured into the holes, broke bulkheads, and rushed through the forecastle and the main cabin. The captain carried his wife into the fore rigging. He lashed her to the crosstrees and then secured himself. The crew were aloft also, secured in the fore and main ratlines. But it was freezing weather. The spindrift that had struck them turned into pellets of ice. Below on deck, the great black, white-crested seas pounded the schooner apart. They made flinders of the deck house, and then the ship broke in half. The stern settled fast. The 3 aftermasts, the rigging slacked, buckled. But the 3 forward masts held in the perpendicular. With dawn, the people who clung to them could see the south shore of the vineyard 3 miles away. Edgartown lay snug behind the arm of Cape Pogue, and the chimney smoke of the early risers could be seen. When a pilot on one of the island steamers looked out over his vessel's bridge wing, across the low hills of the island, he sighted the wreck. This was about an hour after dawn, and word was rapidly passed ashore. The local folks immediately sought out Captain Levi Jackson. He had been famous for some years because of his disregard of personal safety. The Minyard had given him the nickname of Ready to Die. Captain Jackson was without question the man to save the people aboard Myrtle B. Crowley. He was the master of a strongly built auxiliary fishing sloop, Priscilla, and with her had made a number of rescues. But he was still in bed when neighbors knocked at his door and told him of the schooner out on the great shoal. The captain dressed hurriedly, ate his breakfast, and put on his double gear, sea boots and sou'wester. Then he kissed his wife and his newly born son and went down to the fish pier with the neighbors. His crew had already heard about the schooner. They were aboard the Priscilla and had her prepared for sea. The powerful motor was started. Jib and main were hoisted. Priscilla cleared the pier and started to beat around Cape Pogue to windward. Wasp Point at the southeast corner of the vineyard stretched in a huge semicircular formation for 5 miles out to seaward, the outer rim an awful maelstrom of breakers. It would be impossible for any vessel the size of Priscilla to live there. But the foundering schooner was at the westerly end of the shoal, where it curved in back towards the vineyard. Jackson began to bring the sloop around, head her into the quarter-mile of furious surf that separated him from the schooner. Priscilla was close enough now so that he could make out the figures in the rigging, distinguish the huddled ice-sheathed body of the captain's wife. Priscilla gathered speed, thrust on by the awful force of the breakers. The sloop buried herself in half her length, brought water back to the cockpit, shook herself, staggered clear, and rose once more and drove forward. Now she was past the sunken stern of the schooner and abreast of the forepart. Jackson put the wheel over and tried to move upwind toward the hulk, but he could not bring the sloop alongside. That would be suicidal. A single breaker recoil would smash her against the schooner, and she would go with all hands. Jackson stooped over the wheel box, ice white on his mittens where they gripped the spokes, looking forward into the faces of his crew. He did not say anything. The men could not hear him anyway, but they nodded. 4 of them put their dories in the water. They were Patrick Kelly, Eugene Benefit, Louis Donsett, and Henry Kelly. Rowing separate courses, they started for the schooner to take off her people. Mrs. Haskell, the captain's wife, was the first to make the attempt. She jumped with a line around her in the exact split second that one of the dories rose with a wave and was almost parallel with the schooner's main deck. They let go the line on deck, and she landed squarely in the narrow bottom of the dory. She fainted, lying there in the slosh of water, and afterwards Levi Jackson said that it was a good thing. She was a little woman, but with her clothes soaked, she weighed a ton. And we had to grab her by the arms, the hair, the legs, everywhere we could get a hold of. And then we had all we could do to hoist her aboard the Priscilla. All the rest of the people were taken straight from the schooner to the sloop except the steward. He missed his jump from the rail, and reaching out, Patrick Kelly grasped him, tried to pull the man into the dory. But the steward, in panic, capsized the dory. The craft was hurled at once against the schooner and crushed. Kelly rode the crest of a wave and tumbled from it into the schooner's rigging and desperately hung on. Then the steward, also flung upward on a comber, appeared at the bow. His shipmates reached out and grabbed him, and he too was safe. It was a long and dangerous job for the 3 remaining dories to haul the rest of the schooner people and Kelly back to the sloop. But the transfer was made with Captain Haskell in the last boat to make the trip. Then Priscilla began the exceedingly hazardous homeward run. Jackson was given no choice. It was impossible for him to head to seaward against the breakers. He had to go with them, hold them astern, and run the full 7 miles across the shoal to Muskogee Channel. Some of the shoal water was only 3 feet deep, but Jackson followed the gullies, and Priscilla survived. He navigated her into the channel and safely on to Egerton. The Myrtle B. Crowley never did make it to Boston with her coal, but here's a little shanty about Boston that was popular with the sailors back in the 1870s and incorporates a bow-wow chorus picked up from a popular music hall ballad of that time.
From Boston harbor we set sail when it was blowing the devil of a gale, with the ringtail set all the vassum mizzen peak, and the Rule Britannia plowing up the deep.
With a big bow-wow, sow-row-row, foldy-roldy-ride-o-din.
And up comes the skipper from down below. It's look aloft, lads, look alow, then it's look alow, and it's look aloft. And coil up your ropes, lads, fore and aft.
With a big bow-wow, sow-row-row, foldy-roldy-ride-o-din.
And down to his cabin well he quickly crawls, until his poor mix me a glass that'll make me cough. For it's better weather here than it is on top.
With a big bow-wow, sow-row-row, folly-rolly-ride-o-day.
Now there's one thing that we have to crave, that the captain meets with a watery grave, so we'll throw him down into some dark hole, where the sharks will have his body and the devil have his soul.
With a big bow-wow, sow-row-row, folly-rolly-ride-o-day.
Among the fishermen up and down the American coast, and particularly in the New England region, sail power continued well into the 20th century. Gloucester, Massachusetts became the foremost schooner port after the War of 1812, trading in cod, haddock, halibut, and mackerel. There were, by 1850, more than 400 ships sailing out of Gloucester, with 5,000 men serving aboard them. However, there were frightful losses. The average was 89 men a year lost at sea, and most of these were young and heads of families. Gloucester, with a population of around 25,000, very dearly missed them. Still, men kept on sailing to the banks in any kind of weather. During what was to be called the Black Night, 275 men were lost. This was on the Grand Banks, and several times on the Georges Bank, more than 100 Gloucester men were drowned. The record remained grim: 160 men on another night, 140 men on another. Then twice, more than a third of the Gloucester fleet of 40 vessels went down with all hands. The fatalities were expected, and the reasons for them well understood. For centuries, the mothers of New England seagoing families had known of the death toll to be taken. Where two strong boys sat at a breakfast table in their Cape Cod or Gloucester kitchen, a mother could tell herself with absolute chill certainty that one of the pair would not survive. He would be placed on the list of missing from a deepwater ship or from a schooner, or lose his life while hauling lobster pots in the tide rips of the bay. Most of the widows and children never knew just how their men died. They understood a capsized dory or a collision in fog. The rest, often conjecture, was given them by survivors, men who had miraculously escaped a similar death. During the last years of the 19th century, a moving custom gradually arose among the Gloucester widows. Once a year, in August, they gathered to hold a ceremony for the men who had been lost. At first, the ceremony was held in one of the churches, but the crowd soon became too big for the little church. The people then gathered at the westerly end of Main Street, in the park there that is dominated by the tall bronze statue of the fisherman in his oilskins, sea boots, and sou'wester hat. A wreath is placed at the monument, and then people go over the bridge by the cut. The names of the missing men are read. Formal wreaths and bunches of field flowers are lowered into the water. Captains' widows in summer dresses stand beside Portuguese women dressed in full black mourning. The prayers are recited one year by a Protestant minister, the next by a Catholic priest. While the flowers move out in the ebb tide to sea, the 23rd psalm is sung, and that is the end.